Okay.
And welcome everybody to room 221. We have with us Chad Hester, and his talk today is what is user journey mapping and why should I care?
Yep. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
welcome.
Welcome, everybody. Hopefully you're in the right place, and if not, we'll find out. But a little background about myself. I'm Chad Hester. I'm a senior solutions architect at Unleashed Technologies, which is a digital agency out of Columbia, Maryland. We do pretty much everything that you would expect for building websites. I've been a web developer for over two decades now, working very heavily with Drupal for 12 years, an information architect and UX strategist for 10 years now, and an advocate in the open source software and user experience community, like this. So just some quick preamble. Is this a presentation for you? So if you're not familiar with the user journey mapping, or if you're just interested in seeing other techniques for how to do that, this is a good presentation for you. If you want to understand how you can improve user experience and use tools to do that, or exercises and research, this is a presentation for you. And of course, if you're confused as to the difference between user journey mapping, user stories, user personas, user flows, all those sort of things, and you just want some clarity and definition between those different exercises, this is definitely a presentation for you. And the last one I really want to emphasize, this is what gave birth to this presentation. I had many coworkers and clients that simply didn't understand the difference between those things. So we cover all of those things in this presentation to try to establish some baselines and common understanding of where you might want to use those. So let's start with the most important thing. This is about user experience and how to improve that. And that's not just about websites. You can use these tools for, well, anything where a human is interacting with something. But it's important to define a little bit of terminology. These are not interchangeable terms. They from an English language standpoint, sound very similar. You know, story, journey, flow, what a person's doing, who they are. But each of these are very specific tools in the user experience designer or strategist toolkit. So we do want to define what those things are, and we will. And it's also important to acknowledge that user experience research is not perfect. And we're not looking for perfect. We're looking for good enough, something that gives us context and understanding. We want to create empathy. And, you know, I'm 40 years old. I'm a white male. I have my experiences in my career, but I need to understand the experiences of who's using an interface and how they perceive things to be able to make an interface that's more impactful for them. So that's the sort of research that we want to do a lot of times. If you're new to user experience, I do want to emphasize there's a starting point. There's a link down here, and you'll see a bit.ly link at the very end of the presentation for this entire presentation. So no need to try to frantically write these things down. But if you're new to user experience, this link down here, probably one of the best starting points that you could go to. So what are user journeys? So it's important to acknowledge that we need the context of the person and understanding what they do through the steps of an activity. Throughout those steps, they may encounter different touch points. So maybe a newspaper, maybe a commercial, maybe a conversation, maybe a website. All of those are touch points, and sometimes we have different ways to influence those. Along the way, they have different feelings and thoughts, and understanding that helps us empathize with them. And different types of people can have different experiences. So perhaps I'm building something for a university website, and somebody that's an international student may have a different experience than somebody that's an in-state student. And we need to empathize with that to mold their experience. So the user journey is their very specific journey. So what's the difference between a user journey and a user journey map? Well, the map is the exercise. The journey is what actually happens. The map is us trying to plot that out to better understand it, gain context, use that as a tool throughout a design process. And we can come back to that map and update it. Maybe I make a system change. That's totally normal. Maybe I want to add additional journey maps for different types of people. Totally fine as well. So if I wanted to go, buy a car, I might go online, do some research. That's my journey. My father, who's a baby boomer, would probably be more inclined to go directly to a car lot, and that's his journey. And there's nothing invalid about either of our experiences, but it's important to understand the impact of the different touch points that we experience and how we can shape that. A lot of times, journey maps will also align with conversion funnels. So when we're talking about websites, this is a great opportunity to try to clean those things up and understand where people might be frustrated or get stuck. So what are user personas? How does that play into it? Well, user persona helps define and represent an audience segment. It is a design tool. It's something that allows us to capture the idea of a type of person, and then we can utilize that in other exercises. In some cases, we can study real users when we have that opportunity, when we can make that investment as a team. As an agency, I oftentimes work with clients. Those clients many times will give us access to sample users for different segments, which help us empathize and develop a deeper understanding, not just making assumptions, but validating those assumptions or invalidating those assumptions. In some cases, we can't do that. We have to use more passive research tools. Google Analytics isn't really the best, but it can give you some information that you can rely on for things like demographics and interests. And then you have to rely on method acting as that character. It's not really the recommended way of developing a persona. I would try to really get in touch with users and study them directly. So really, you want to ask questions. What do you need to know about that audience segment, and how can you capture that in a persona? So I like to really lean on this. Whenever you're trying to do research, start off with what questions you're trying to answer, and then shape whatever research and exercises to develop that understanding and directly answer those questions. So how do you create a user persona? Well, you can certainly start by collecting demographic information. That helps capture things like salary ranges, job titles, interests, hobbies, just different motivating factors. So that way we can reference those throughout any sort of design exercises. Take a look at any sort of analytics. If you have run any surveys, try not to overload people with questions on surveys. Keep them maybe around about 5 questions and use good participation patterns, if you will. Take a look at user feedback logs. So if there's a customer service department, or if there's emails, phone call logs, anything like that, that can help you see the direct accounts from a customer or a user of a system, that can allow you to see something where you don't have to directly talk to them. If you can, interview them. Try to find out what you'd like to learn from them. Do user testing. Have them try to use a product or a website or whatever it is that you're testing to see what their behavior is. Give them a task and see if they can complete it. And if not, just ask them about that. Oftentimes you'll see this alliterated name. So if I have an association, maybe I'll call a member, audience segment, Michael member or Michelle member. So that way we're alliterating, and it kind of sticks in the head a little bit. Give them an age, occupation, salary, write down what their goals and motivations are, maybe a brief bio, and then relate that user persona to any sort of applicable task. What would they typically be doing on your website? Don't just randomly grab a bunch of motivating factors that have nothing to do with the behavior on your website. Try to keep it applicable to what it is that you're building. So this is just a simple example. This is from an organization that our company worked with, NAGAS, the National Guard Association of the United States. So we developed a number of different user personas. They have different types of memberships, and of course, different age ranges, different motivating factors. So we really wanted to dig in and try to create something to build that empathy for this audience segment. So what are user stories? How does that relate to all of these things? Well, a user story is not a user journey. The words sound the same, but they are two different exercises in user experience work. Typically, they're small tasks. The smaller, the better. The more you can break it down, the better. I go through a checkout process, but there might be multiple steps. Can we break that down? And by developing that, that develops the what. What is a person capable of doing in a system? Not necessarily the how. The how is what technology you might use, what it looks like. So the user stories oftentimes will be grouped by epics. Maybe checkout process is your epic, and the granular, add item to cart, add payment information, add shipping information, reviewing my order. Those are your more individual user stories. And that helps with things like user acceptance testing and agile development. You may have heard of the concept of a minimum viable product. Well, that's an important part of user story mapping. So again, we're trying to answer questions. Who is this person? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? And how is it different for different people? So when you write a user story, that's what you're trying to capture: who, what, and why. Now, there are long form versions of user story accounts. So you can see there's subtle differences at times between them. So a high school student applying for a student loan so they can attend college. But a parent could theoretically do that as well, applying for a student loan so their child can attend college. And the subtle differences between those help us capture potential different paths on what it is that we build. And getting that granular can be pretty helpful to identify what it is that you want to prioritize. But you can also do short form user stories. I like to think of these as more verb-noun pairs. So apply for student loan, apply the verb, student loan, the noun. This is a way of very rapidly writing them down on Post-it notes when you're doing that user story mapping process. And oftentimes as a physical group, we'll use something like a whiteboard and Post-it notes, typically Sharpies, or if you're on a whiteboard, not to confuse Sharpies with dry erase markers, lean on the latter. Now that many of us are remote, I would recommend a tool like Mural, which is a good remote tool, allows you collaboration between people, and effectively does a similar sort of process. But we'll typically try to divide things up a little bit into epics, try to identify the most important user stories, and divide a blue line between what we want to be in our first initial build versus things that are a little bit more nice to have. If you want to learn more about that process, I'd recommend the de facto book on this practice, the user story mapping book. It's a O'Reilly book. So how's that different from a user flow? So a user flow contains similar elements to a user journey map. It's the process. So you could use different techniques. This is just a diagramming technique of what steps are in a process. And sometimes it branches out. So you may use what we call wire flows. So these are very small iconic images, stencils, if you will, of what a page could look like. So is it a landing page? Is it a listing page? Is it some sort of micro interaction? How are people moving from step to step? What are the steps in the process? What are the decisions along the way? And this allows us to really understand the effectiveness of a process, just more from a sequential standpoint. Or are there too many steps? Are there enough steps? Do the steps make sense? So oftentimes this is a good place to start before doing user journey maps, just to acknowledge what is the process. This is not so much of an empathetic tool. This is you going through and applying for a student loan. What are the steps that you would encounter? But I don't know who you are. I'm not really spending time identifying that. So that's how a user flow is different from a user journey map. So again, we're trying to answer questions with these exercises. Where do I start? What choices can I make? What's happening next? And is there a goal? So this is an example of a user flow. This is what we call a page flow. Uses little stencils to represent the different pages, not really meant to be fleshed out wireframes, but just more of a visual cue. landing pages, moving through main nav. And typically with a user flow, again, we're trying to ask a question. So in this case, how does a member join this association? Well, we have answers. There's actually two answers here. Either they're joining as a new member and going through a process there, which actually sends them off to a separate website. And because they're a national organization, they also have relationships with different state organizations, the state version of that. And how you join really depends on what state you're in. So we had to illustrate that, and that helps us understand what the process is, because we could potentially improve upon that. So we put a note here about a few questions, potential areas of improvement along the way. If you're an existing member, that becomes a different flow. So if you're renewing, that's a different process specifically for them. So capturing these differences is very important to construct new interfaces or improve upon them, and to just at least capture what that is. So a few others, event registration, what's the process there? What are some theoretical new pathways that we could carve out? And you'll notice there are annotations along the way, just for us to have a good, clean diagram, but at least list out some notes about what the steps are in the process. So you don't have to make one that looks precisely like this, but this is the general point of just illustrating what the process is. So if you're feeling a little bit lost, that's normal. We're just trying to ask questions here. And with each one of these exercises, they all try to answer different questions. Personas are just about capturing who your audience segments are and a way of empathizing with them. User stories and user story mapping are the individual stories for acceptance testing, and story mapping is a bit more of a comprehensive exercise to help carve out an MVP and inform an agile build process. User flows are the steps that you can go along the way, and there are different forms of that. It could just be a normal process diagram. User journeys are the literal experiences that people have, and user journey mapping is the actual process of documenting that. Don't know why that slide's not loading, so we'll go ahead and skip it. So let's talk about user journey mapping directly. What's involved? Well, as with most documentation, you want to start off with a common template, just blank. It's okay, you can update that template over time as you evolve, or you can have several templates. Absolutely fine. Because it's an empathetic document, we want to acknowledge what the user persona is that relates to that specific journey. So again, back to that example, we could have one journey for an international student applying for a student loan, or let's say Johns Hopkins University, or an in-state student. And that process might be subtly different. They may have different feelings. They may have different touch points, and that's normal. And we can shape the experience for both of them. You want to document the basic sequence of tasks. And this is why starting off with user flows is helpful, because you may already know what that sequence of tasks is. Maybe it's a little bit different for those two audience types, but it at least gives you a nice starting point that you can build upon. And the stages of a process. So for example, conversion funnel is a common thing to document in a journey map. There are different stages that a person goes through. Just awareness, discovery, what is this thing? Interest and consideration. Should I go to this school? Can I afford it? And then evaluation and conversion. Okay, let's go ahead and fill this out and submit this form, or complete a payment or something along those lines. We want to indicate the touch points, the medium or the device along the way in the user journey. Because when you take a look at something like a website, that's not the only experience a person's having. If I want to go to a restaurant tonight, which I probably shouldn't, but generally speaking, if I wanted to go to a restaurant tonight, I might go to their website, take a look at their menu, maybe look at their Facebook page, maybe even call them to see if they take reservations. I just had 3 touch points right there: social media, website, and a phone call. And then I have another touch point when I actually go there in person and have an experience there. For me as a human being, all of that is my experience. But as someone who's designing systems, there are some parts of that that you can impact and some you can't. We can control the social media channels and what information we put there. We can control the website and how it is designed and what information it provides people. We can train our staff on how to handle phone calls, train our staff on how to handle the experience in person. And each one of those things should be deliberate. But if you haven't thought about those things, empathizing through that process and knowing how to shape those touch points is important. When doing a journey map, you want to capture the thoughts that a person's having at each step and also graph their emotional state. Some emotions are positive, some emotions are negative, some emotions are neutral. And understanding the impact to action is very important. And we'll take a look at that in some of our examples. So once you have a journey map, what do you do with it? Well, you are certainly oftentimes beholden to stakeholders. So as a user experience designer, you want to make recommendations to stakeholders. Here's what we observed, here's what people told us, here's the process. We think people are struggling here. Maybe we can change these steps because here's how they're thinking and feeling. Maybe you can reduce the steps. Maybe you can just change the interfaces. There are a lot of opportunities there. And this is not a one and done sort of thing. It's a tool. You can come back to it. You can refine it. We want to sometimes even present our findings to our users. What if I'm developing an intranet and those users are helping us groom their own experience? In some cases, you're building those sort of things. So it may be helpful to use those tools to communicate as a team. Test, interview, validate what it is that you can learn. The more real feedback that you can get from the people that are having an experience, the better. Oftentimes, we've all heard, hey, let's install the user experience module, or can you just make it have a good user experience? Just make it look good. That's not user experience. That's a part of it. But I think it's really important to emphasize, if you go to a hotel, you have an experience. It's there, it's intrinsic. Is it a good experience or a bad experience? That's really dependent on somebody paying attention and studying those things. Maybe you care about the breakfast bar. Well, do they know that? Have they improved that experience? What have they done? How have they studied and gained feedback and learned from that and adapted? So again, user journey mapping is a tool to really help gain visibility on those sort of things and try to improve them when you're studying them deliberately. In preparation for user journey mapping, you can also create user stories to identify the critical tasks if anything's missing and come back to things like user journey maps to improve upon them. You can go back to user flows and model some improvements. Maybe the steps change. It's a theoretical, and then you can implement it and go back to the journey after you've built it to see how people feel about it. So it's a cyclical thing. At the end of this process, you also want to try to work with your team to identify the sort of things that you want to change. And again, in the agile process, that's typically in a backlog. So this is a tool for empathy. Again, we're asking ourselves questions and using a tool like user journey mapping to try to answer those questions. Are there good examples of user journey maps? Oh, there are so many. So many that you might get a little overwhelmed by it and really start scratching your head as to how you could implement this in your own use case. So I did create a generic example that anybody can take away. I did get permission from the National Guard Association of the United States to use their journey maps in this presentation. So we'll take a look at both of those now. So a simple example. I've got a guy, Michael Member, age 72, works out of Bethesda, Maryland. He's the CEO at Example Company, makes about $200K a year. His primary interest is sailing. What that has to do with this process of going through and attending a conference, I don't know what sailing has to do with it, but that's his interest. We dig into his bio a little bit more. We can see that he attends conferences, connects with his peers, stays current with industry trends, increases political awareness, prepares for retirement, promotes key prepares for retirement? Yes, he's 72. He has motivations. This is a part of his story. This is who we've captured. The reason that we're emphasizing this is he's a CEO that's trying to retire. And that changes his behavior pattern a little bit, changes his emotional state, and we can project a bit of that. So we can see here, he read a conference brochure, and let's take a look at this. So the persona's on the left, And we can see at the top the different phases. So we have awareness, discovery, interest, consideration, and evaluation conversion. There are different steps that you're seeing here too. Read the conference brochure, consider conference attendance. So that's in this consideration side. And you have several steps that eventually lead to registering for an event. And then maybe even returning to the website for next year's conference. So there's even a little bit of a lead off there. There are different touch points. So a discussion about the conference, that's just a conversation. You have no control over that, but you have control over what leads up to it and what follows it. So the brochure for the conference, you have control over that. That's maybe a print material that he received at another event or from a colleague. Considering the attendance, going to the website, you can see his thoughts along the way. A coworker reminded me about the upcoming conference. I want to attend this year's conference. My secretary is reviewing registration and travel options. I'm worried about expenses. These are normal things. And you can see the emotional state should really follow that as well. So we have, being excited about that conference. Planning, well, that's a bit more neutral. Worried about expense, that worry is more of a negative emotion in this sense. Eager to book attendance, difficult finding information, booking travel and the conference. Happy to see and talk to peers. So the emotional state's normal. And a lot of this happens so rapidly over a period of time that the person experiencing them doesn't notice them unless they're taking stock, unless they're being deliberate about that. A couple others that we have here. So here's an illustration of a journey map for an individual member joining NAGIS. A bit more detail in terms of the steps and the emotional states, the roller coaster, if you will, throughout this experience. A corporate member joining, a little bit different, and there are different touch points that occur here. A lot of times when you have somebody renewing, there's a different motivation than if they're a brand new member, and illustrating the difference between a new member and an existing member renewing is important because they want to make sure that they're going to get the same value, if not improved value, for their membership year over year. So the emotional roller coaster is a little bit different and the touch points are a little bit different. The process is a little bit different and their thoughts may be different as well. Event registration, similar to the previous one, but a bit more complicated specifically for NAGIS. There are different touch points that a person can experience as well. In this case, they may have read a news article on the website and observed that the conference is coming up, or received an email notification, and in both cases noticed a link that allows them to read more about that conference and then go through the consideration phase and then finally the conversion phase. I do want to hang on this example. NAGIS in particular, as any sort of military association may have, has ties into the political atmosphere. And as somebody that goes through this type of a funnel, writing to Congress, they may see some sort of an article that gets them kind of happy about the information of the article, but maybe upset about the substance of it. Maybe read a newspaper article, maybe see something on a television segment. These are all those different touch points. But the point that I'm making here is that not all conversion funnels, not all actions are bound to a positive emotion. In this case, this fictional scenario here, this person is upset and they are prompted to write to Congress because they're upset, because they are motivated. And I think it's important to acknowledge those sort of occasional negative patterns. And you're not trying to make them upset, but you're trying to provide them facilities to channel those emotions into a positive action. In this case, writing to Congress. In the case of NAGIS, this was one area where we made improvements from their old site. Just the newsletter sign-up process was very convoluted on their old site. And we observed along the way, perhaps one of the ways to incentivize people to sign up for their newsletter would just be to show them an example of that. So that's journey mapping. And there are a lot of different types. You don't have to use the template that I just showed you. It's mostly just about making sure that you understand who's going through a process, what that process is, what people are thinking, what people are feeling, and what sort of touch points they're experiencing along the way. that helps you as designers, as developers, or project managers, or business owners understand how it is that you can shape these things to be a bit more effective. So how do you improve? Well, first off, I'm in love with the learning process. I think that there is a bit of responsibility that we all have to understand where we are in learning. Nobody knows it all. It's not possible. But at some point, something moves from unknown to encountered. Sometimes you want to become more acquainted to something. So maybe you read a blog post about user journey mapping. Then you find this is something that you want to do. So then you start to study it. And study is book learning, video watching, that sort of thing. At some point, you have to move from studying to practicing. And that's when you're becoming more experienced. If you really love doing this type of work, then eventually you could master it. How long does that take? It really depends entirely on the subject matter. And how do you learn in general? Well, find a mentor. As someone who is mostly self-taught, I can tell you it is one of the most expensive ways to learn because there's a lot of trial and error. So find a mentor, have a guide, attend social events like Nerd Summit. Try to participate too. One of the best ways to learn is to also teach. Study, practice is most important, and try to review those things with other people. Discuss them, present, consider new tools, extend your toolkit, find new techniques, and just repeat all of this. So there are a lot of links here. I'm not going to read them all. But there are some links for different parts of this presentation that we went through. So for user personas, if you've never done that, or if you just want to learn more about it. For user stories and user story mapping, there's a number of different articles that you can read about that. User flows, which are great diagramming tools, what we call a bottom-up artifact. You're studying something very specific. And then, of course, user journey mapping. There are a number of articles about how to create them in different ways. So, without further ado, if you want to work with or for Unleash Technologies, the company that I work for, please certainly get in touch. Thank you very much for participating in this presentation. If you want to get in touch with our company, you can contact us at start@unleash-technologies.com. The slides, if you wanted to jot down the link, and it should also be shared in the recording, is this bit.ly link here, nerd-summit-2020-user-journey-mapping. Too many dashes. So any questions from the group?
Chad, it's Eric. I just wanted to say this was really awesome. I'm in the middle of a project that is attempting user stories and journey mapping, and so far we are doing a pretty poor job of it. And so I'm explicitly trying to get smarter on this. And this was great.
Yeah, thank you. I would stress that there's no one way to do these things. Just study and try it out a few times. And it's okay to make mistakes along the way. It's not meant to be perfect. But the one thing that I would really lean on is try to understand your audience. Don't guess, don't assume, because what's the penalty of making a poor assumption about something? So try to interview people, find out what you don't know, and do some user testing. So those emotional states, those thoughts along the process, oftentimes happen so fast that people can't really capture them. But if you can have somebody do a task, go through a conversion funnel, something like that, and interview them along the way, you can ask questions about their experience to gain insight and record those sort of things. So that way you can study them over and over again and extract that information and then create a user journey map.
Chad, I've got, I threw 3 things into the chat session.
Yep.
And 2 of them relate to, I guess, more the engineering aspect of this.
Sure.
I spent a good bit of time at Rational Software, and we did a lot with use cases. So trying to tie the terminology together so that I can have a translation matrix in my head would be helpful. Secondly, trying to keep the system in sync, because when we create a site, based on, or create a process based on initial user journey mapping, that system is not static. That system will constantly change. And so how do we have bidirectional synchronization between the site and our journey maps and so on? And then the third one I'll defer for a bit.
Sure. So let's talk about use cases. I think a use case is a scenario that you have in mind, or considerations. I like neutral words because it doesn't judge them. So I think really a use case is bound to the type of person and the type of activity. There's a marriage between what a person's doing and who they are. So a common example I like using is that university applying for a student loan. Well, an out-of-state student will have a slightly different experience than an in-state student, or a parent may have a different experience than a high school student. They may be the exact same process on the interface that you provide to them. However, their experience may differ because of who they are and what their background is. So it's important, I think, to use tools to try to define that. So for example, a user flow captures the process. That process may be identical for all audiences. However, a user journey map may illustrate the differences in thoughts and feelings and touch points in that exact same process. So they're just different tools to give you different helpful perspectives, and then understand as a team, no one person really should be studying this stuff. Multiple people should look at this stuff once it's produced and see, okay, what things stand out? What things are obvious? Well, okay, they really hate that form. They've said as much. They feel bad about it. It frustrates them. So maybe we can do something to maybe do some A/B testing to improve that form. So I think that's one way that you can tie these things into use cases. User story mapping, I think, is another very helpful tool. So we talk about artifacts from the perspective of either top down, a bird's eye view, like, can I see the whole thing? How does all of this work? But you don't get a lot of detail, and you shouldn't. That's the breadth and not depth side of things. Or you have a bottom-up artifact, these diagrams that illustrate just one thing in an entire system, but that's it. And it puts a lot of detail in it. So I think it's important to create artifacts that do both of those things to give you different perspectives of what a system architecture should be, how things work, how people experience them, to gain different perspectives. So user story mapping can give you that high level perspective, oftentimes with a good bit of detail, but also allow you to carve out what you intend to either work on now, or at least capture the current state, if you will. Taking a look, yeah, sorry.
No, I'll defer.
Taking a look at your other question, you said, how do you keep journey maps in sync with implementation? I think it's exactly that, is just carving out the time for it, making space for it. So I would never expect a journey map to be a perfect mirror image of a system, because look, I could go to a Marriott today and that experience is going to be different than the last time I went there. That's normal. So same thing is true with a website. If somebody went there a few months ago, even if nothing changed in the build, their experience could be different because, you know, we're all different people over the course of time, but more importantly, our activities slightly change. What am I trying to do on that website? And sometimes I'll make different choices. Maybe the amount of familiarity I had from last time also changed. Maybe I was frustrated the first time, but now since I've gone through it, I'm less frustrated the second time. So I think to more try to directly answer your question, once you create a journey map and you make tweaks to a system, it's your responsibility to go back to that journey map if it helps you to sync it up. If it doesn't help you, that's fine. Just leave it on the bench. It doesn't need to be a perfect mirror copy. I think one of my favorite values of the Agile Manifesto was we favor working software over comprehensive documentation. So as a user, I can't use your documentation. It doesn't impact me directly. I don't see it. I see your working software. But if that documentation helps improve it, go forth, do whatever you need to do to improve the system.
Okay. Yeah, that's a separable discussion, particularly about institutional knowledge and technical debt and all the things that go on there. So I have a third question, but I'll defer to somebody else if they've got one.
Okay. I'm taking a look at this question, recommended books on journey mapping, so you don't try to read them all. I appreciate the spirit of your question. Again, as someone that's self-taught largely for a lot of these sort of things, I can tell you, being without some sort of guidance, you end up investing so much time trying to, separate the signal from the noise, if you will. But in this subject matter, there are a lot of really good resources. Books in particular about journey mapping, I can't think of any off the top of my head. Story mapping, yes. Journey mapping, no. Not to say that there aren't any out there, but I did include a couple links in here for journey mapping articles. So that might be a good place to start. And I can't stress this enough. Balance study with practice. Get your hands dirty, make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes, but that practice will let you know how these things can be a little bit more effective for your work. Hopefully that answered your question. Any other questions?
So I'm going to one comment and then my third question. A comment was we used to do a thing called contextual inquiry, which is basically shadowing people who are using our products. And this was back in the dark ages when we used to deliver big honking binders full of technical documentation. And it was very humbling to go to a customer site and see boxes of this stuff still shrink wrapped, unencumbered by usage, that most people wouldn't read the documentation. They would stand up and ask somebody in the office who they thought had read it and who understood it, because they much preferred that to wading through whatever we produced. But my question is how do you deal with unlearning that, particularly as you make UI changes, as the world shifts, perhaps from desktop to mobile, from one set of implementations to another. People have to be willing to let go of what they used to know and what they believe they had mastered in order to embrace this new thing. And so how do you deal with that, and how do you deal with I guess what I would call the grieving process of having to surrender knowledge in order to gain new knowledge?
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I would actually attack that from two different perspectives, because I think there are a lot of examples of that in our field. So the first is, well, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. If there is truly something of value that has staying power in our industry, I think it's important for new participants to understand those sort of tools, those sort of experiences. It doesn't nullify the investment that people have made in those understandings if they're still valuable. But that's the responsibility we have. Our notions, our experience is still valid today with whatever it is that we're studying. So I think it's important for us to challenge each other politely. There's actually a really good book specifically about communicating as a team that I would recommend, especially for any leaders, called Radical Candor. I'm not going to explain the book, but it's a really good book for having better, more healthy communication and relationships at work. But the other side is, people also rest on their laurels. This worked, so why shouldn't it keep working? And that's not a very scientific way of thinking about things. So I think what's more appropriate is to hold ourselves responsible for the changes in human behavior and perception. So just because I studied a system, which may not have even changed, the audience themselves can change, the world changes. And if we aren't constantly studying it, it gets stale and less useful. So the words that I would choose here aren't things like perfect or best. those are absolute words, and they're very distracting from what we're trying to achieve. Instead, I would use the words effective and good enough. So if we can establish what is good enough, oftentimes that requires us getting out of our own heads and talking directly with our audience. Is this good enough? Were you able to do that? And that's a testable thing. So if we can bring things back to the level of, can I test this? Get myself out of my own assumptions. If I do make assumptions, are they validated? Can I test those? I think that holds us a little bit more responsible for what it is that we're trying to achieve. And I think it, to that unlearning sort of pattern, helps us get to the point where we're relearning. So I like to tell people learning is our currency. If we're not constantly learning, then we're going to suffer potentially that much more. Somebody, of course, pinned the notion of failure is not an option. Whoever said that, I'm sure, has failed many times in their life. That failure is absolutely always an option. And to, play against that Boy Scout motto, we want to be prepared for those sort of things. And you can do that by having things like KPIs to measure the health of an organization or the thing that you're working on. Actively monitoring and measuring the things that help check the vitals of the systems. Test things, be empathetic. Make sure that you're holding yourself accountable for improving upon things. Lean Startup, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, really professes the model of build, measure, learn. So we want to build something, then we want to measure its effectiveness, and then we want to learn from that to improve upon that. And if we can get into those cycles, we are constantly learning, and that is a much healthier behavior pattern.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Chad. That's a very informative presentation. I had no idea. That was
Sure, absolutely.
So we also have breakout rooms and in the coffee, was it coffee and networking too, if anyone wants to go and talk more about this topic. I'm going to...
There's some, I think there are some birds of a feather that are slowly getting organized. One, at least one or more, I'm sure is going to be around Agile. But if I can somehow make it to a couple, I would absolutely love to be part of a birds of a feather group on user journey mapping.